Okay, so good evening, everybody. For people that need headphones, I'm going to be speaking English. Unfortunately, even though this is my second time in Pamplona and I don't know what time in Spain, I will not be speaking this one as well. Okay. I will not be speaking in Spanish, but welcome everybody, and I'm going to try to make my presentation short enough or maybe interesting enough, and Luis is going to wave when I have to stop. And I'm going to try to, let's say, amuse you or maybe pose some questions through the work that we have carried out in the past 10 years in our practice. So I'm going to try to present some of the work. Well, first, in the beginning, of course, I have to mention that I think that this event has proven to be something extremely interesting, and I think also from the conversations that we had today on the stage, and also from the work that we have seen in the past 2 days, some of which is really amazing, and some of which really makes you pose questions about the two lectures yesterday of Solano and Anna, of the kind of ignorance that we as European architects or Eurocentric or however you want to put it, architects have towards this kind of 4/5 of the globe that we choose to ignore in our somehow choose to ignore or like forget about in the work that we carry out. And this is maybe, I'm going to stop talking about beauty because this is something that I really don't feel, despite the fact that Luis is going to accuse me afterwards, very comfortable about. And I'm going to stop talking about pleasure because for me it's, as I said before, it's just a consequence of what you do, and in a sense not in itself, maybe not even the most important aspect of what we do as architects. But I'm going to lean onto the idea of Común and the ideas posed yesterday by the two presentations of Solano and Anna, where they showed us some incredible projects and some incredible work, and the work that either has to do very much with the aspects of social or with the aspects of technique, and as in the case of Solano, and the kind of poetic level of development of technique. And that immediately brought another question. I'm not trying to say that, or another kind of point of view that we as European architects might have about the work that we carry out. And it is the idea of technique versus culture, which was also mentioned, I think, in some conversations yesterday. The idea that our super over-regulated profession, which actually in the past has been so incredibly, at least in the European context, or been so incredibly over-regulated, simply forces you to maybe look for other issues and other tools with which to face the current reality that we exist in. And if I've spoken to a few of the students, and of course I've spoken to people from Arquitectura en Sociedad who actually made all of this event possible, and I think this is incredible in a way in which this event worked, and in which they could also continue to work in the future. And I see this kind of potential future exactly in this kind of a confrontation, not a confrontation, but a kind of a joint venture in between different professions, because as architects very often we exist within a kind of a limited world of our profession, and fail to see, like with other parts of our own profession, but also fail to see the rest of the world in the sense of the world, in the sense of the word. And so I'm going to try and present today some of the projects of our office, and I'm going to maybe touch upon the idea of Común in whatever meaning it may be understood. Común, of course, can be understood in very many meanings, and if you only go to a dictionary for a few seconds, you will realize that it can be everything from familiar to shared to ordinary, which is something that appeals to me personally very much, the idea of ordinariness, because I think it is out of ordinariness that it's the only tool that helps us create extraordinary, so that out of everyday we can, in fact, only the everyday can be the tool that we can use in order to create a kind of a maybe different universe that we live in. And the last 2 days, in talking to a few students, especially the guys who were kind enough to kind of lend their hand in driving us here and there, I realized that there is this kind of the idea of crisis that everybody seems to be talking about. And of course, Spain is at the moment extremely popular, especially with the economic newspapers all around Europe, and we are all aware of the way you are going, but I can assure you that this is the way we are going as well. So I think that this is a shared destiny that we are all faced with. And of course, the kind of questions posed by students who are maybe 2 decades younger than myself make you basically either not panic, but either start thinking in this kind of about the idea of crisis. I think it is not the current crisis that is the problem that we face as architects. And I think that this current crisis is really, in a way, of course, it's very dramatic. Of course, there's this incredible potential for social clashes, but you could also see it in a slightly more positive way, that we are going to all have to change. And I'm not talking here about architecture per se, but I'm talking about the society as a whole, or us as humans, that basically it's going to push us in directions that maybe a few years ago, allowed with the kind of incredible shower of mortgages that we had from the banks, we didn't really realize. And in that sense, well, the crisis, at least, as you were trying to point out also before, could also be seen as a positive thing. I don't know the origins of this crisis. I don't know, and I think the origins could very easily be going much further than we ever thought. And it could be somewhere much further back in the future. Is this going to start working now? Yes. And I'm going to, of course, start with an artwork and raise again the argument of the relation between our profession and art. And I'm starting with a very simple work of art by contemporary German artist Thomas Locher, which has inside the pictorial space of this thing a kind of a small text embedded, which says there is a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. And it's a kind of prophetic text that we as humans have started over the course of history, or over the course of recent history, relating to each other as if we are, very often as if we are things. But the funny thing happens when you start reading the text next to this painting, when you realize that the title of this painting is Das Kapital, and C, okay? This is quote number C from a book that is actually much older than we can imagine. And sometimes you start wondering whether the problems which are escalating in our lives today actually started and began somewhere much earlier, and much further, in a kind of a set of basic relations that we have established in between ourselves since the first industrial revolution onwards. Of course, it's very far-fetched, and as architects, and as an architect, I'm not even going to try to explain this, and I'm not going to probably go any deeper than just mention it. But as the point today, I'm going to propose maybe a general point, the idea that as a European architect, maybe, and as somebody who is unable to kind of grasp in totality the work that our colleagues are doing in Bangladesh or in Paraguay, or the kind of maybe that it is our culture and our history as a kind of a common ground which we can use in kind of potentials for reconstruction of our profession. And of course, the common ground for us and for me and my partner for the office is indeed the space where we work. All of our work has been carried out in a very, well, at the moment, very remote region from here. It took me 10 hours to get here, although it's just another country in Europe. But our work is confined to this region, and for us, this is a common, well, this or that is our common ground. I think that there are a lot of things that we share, and there are a lot of points in which our two common grounds in this sense will overlap. This is the city of Ljubljana, where I come from. And it's a kind of a mix of everything from Middle Ages to modernism, and it is the capital of Slovenia, and Slovenia is a country which exists only for 20 years. This is something that we don't have in common. We actually have a very short history. We have a history which started only 20 years ago this year, and this is something that has to be taken into account when thinking about what we do. And the idea of Slovenia, with many of you that you have been there or haven't been there, is the idea of these incredible landscapes, and indeed the incredible landscapes are the character of Slovenia. It is something that also is embedded in what we do, and a lot of our work is carried out in this, with this kind of idea of a landscape in mind. And within this landscape, there have been these historical models which have, of architectures that have developed over time, and these are the houses, the buildings that are like haystacks. This is where you dry grass in a region which is about 1 hour away from Ljubljana. So almost a kind of an inhabitable structure, but then used for a kind of agricultural purpose. And something that we all share, I think, and you can see it the moment you go out of this hall, the destruction that the European landscape has actually, that has happened throughout the European landscape from the Second World War onwards, it has not saved us, despite the fact that we were seemingly under the cover of the kind of a socialist regime. I think the destruction is something that brings us together. We have managed to destroy most of our spaces, and if you go to the periphery of Pamplona, I think the picture would be more or less the same. So this is maybe a common ground that we share, that that I think is somewhere where we could meet. Another thing that I think defines us as architects working in Slovenia, not working from Slovenia, is the presence of this kind of an incredible architectural figure within the history of this country. However short the history is and however small the country is, it's only 2 million people. It does have this person. This is Jože Plečnik, and this is a National University Library in Ljubljana. This is a building which embodies the idea of Slovene national identity, built in 1939. It is the first public building to mention Slovenes in history, I mean, in a formal way. And it is also the idea of Jože Plečnik, who is in a way a master of Slovenia, but also a master of Ljubljana. Practically everything when you walk around the city of Ljubljana that you will see will be in a way touched by his hand and created by him. So the urban planning of Ljubljana, the way the rivers are regulated, quite a few of the buildings, and the way the monuments have been set up, the way the benches are set up, the benches themselves have been designed by this guy. It is something very important. It is maybe the only other place that I can imagine relates in a very similar way to a kind of an architect in its in the idea of national identity is maybe Finland, where Alvar Aalto has managed to achieve this kind of status of being somebody whose work is so incredibly intrinsically related to the idea of Finland. And then, of course, this is the favorite building of me and my partner. This is a building by Plečnik in cemetery of Žale. It is not a real building that is used in a cemetery. This is where they make the caskets. This is where they make the caskets in which you're going to bury the people. And it shows you this kind of incredible span of influences that Plečnik managed to kind of converge into one point, into everything from these orthodox graffitos that you see on the upper floor, which kind of carry the roof of this building where you are supposed to dry the wood, to the kind of a northern, almost, well, to the kind of Viennese influences, of course, because he was educated there, but also to the kind of the northern European influences that you see at the bottom part of this building. And I think this, in a way, shows you a kind of a context that I think is very important for everything that we do and everything that we work on in Slovenia, and I think I have to show it in advance. Another project which relates directly to the idea of common is the project that Plečnik did in 1944. At the moment, he was a devout Catholic, and at the moment when the communists came into power, this is the project that he proposes to the new city government. He proposes to build something which is called houses under common roof. So he proposes to swap the idea of a change of a political system to a change of a set of social relations. As a kind of a deeply Catholic person, he proposes a kind of a continuous roof which the community would build, and then everybody would be able to build their own house under this kind of communal roof. Of course, this project is just one drawing which exists in his archive, and not much more than that, but I think it fits very well into this idea of common. And we have seen, despite the apparent classical language of Plečnik, we have seen, I think, this kind of ideas developed in the rest of Europe maybe 2 decades later. And another contemporary artist from Slovenia, Marjetica Potrč, the winner of a Guggenheim Prize 2 years ago, working on a very similar project recently for Caracas. Slovene architectural history is not that limited. Of course, it's not limited to one person. There are other people like Edward Ravnikar, and I'm mentioning just a few names, who was a student of Plečnik and also of Corbusier, and who broke with this tradition of Plečnik. But also something that especially interests us in the office is this kind of example of this kind of quiet traditions that exist in Slovenia at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. Architect whose name was Otto Jugovec created this roof over archaeological ruins somewhere in the fields on the border of Croatia. And basically, at the point where the rest of Europe was starting its incredible proliferation of what we later started calling the postmodern times, managed maybe to come very close to what Frampton was calling in his books the critical regionalism, the idea of a marriage of a modernity with a kind of a regional languages that exist within a certain territory. I have tried to maybe just briefly illustrate, because I think all of these things influence what we work on and what we do in our work. But also there are things that we, and some of these things are specific to us, some of these things are specific to our profession, and some of these things are specific to all of us as humans. Because the idea of community, I think Solano made a very good comment yesterday when he said that we become humans when we are two. And I think this is an incredibly powerful and a kind of moving statement, that the moment that we, but in another sense also I would like to extend that thought and say that we also become a community the moment we become two. So I think the idea of, because when you become two, you're not also only reflected in a mirror, you're basically able to communicate and you're basically able to exchange. So therefore, the idea of common, I think, starts much earlier than we think. We have seen a lot of public spaces yesterday in the presentation of Norman Foster, which are either a consequence of the buildings that he has been doing or just per se projects of public spaces, and those are of course very large common spaces of our where our humanity can meet, but I think the common space of our intimacies is also as important as that one. And this is another artist. This is a Korean artist whose name is Do Ho Soo. And when you look at this work from a distance, or when it's a very large painting, you basically see it as a kind of a sea of seemingly red dots that kind of dot this huge canvas. But when you come near the canvas, there are 5 or 6 millimeters in size, millions and millions of human faces. And this kind of the oscillation that we have between the kind of thought of this kind of incredible world that surrounds us, of 7 billion, however many billion people, and the kind of individuals located within that enormous field of a world is something that, as architects, you have to be able to balance in between those things simultaneously. And therefore, as I said, the idea of community and the idea of common space starts already within the kind of minimal relations that we may have with the members of our family, or the members with or our girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, and our neighbors, and then goes further to our neighbors and whatever. This is maybe a diagram that we use very often to illustrate two things. One thing is that dissolution of the idea of a unit, of an apartment, of a house, that has happened also, I think, mainly in the last 15 years, where our houses have started to kind of communicate with the outside world and no longer provided only a shelter to be protected from the elements of nature. Maybe it's centuries that we have been doing this. And the idea of what these things could do within seas of other houses, because this is actually what we are surrounded by. We are not surrounded only by this kind of incredibly pristine and beautiful nature. We are all surrounded by dirt, and we are surrounded by destruction, and we are surrounded by the things such as this. This is a suburbia of Ljubljana, and it is an area which has become, which has been entirely illegally built in the 1970s, so all of this stuff was just land which was basically occupied by people, and it was actually looked upon by the socialist governments as a kind of a way out, or a kind of a relief to people, to allow them to be able to build something on their own, and therefore satisfy their eagerness to have their own roof over their head. Okay, this was built later, this is something else. So a friend of ours bought a plot of land, and I'm going to now to try and show how I think the changes that we need to implement go much deeper, and could be rooted in our history, in our culture, in our tradition, as well as technique, of course. So bought a plot of land at the edge of it with a kind of a northern orientation towards this beautiful forest, but actually facing all of this destructed landscape. And this is the kind of the view of the forest, and this is what made him buy the house, and made him worry incredibly about not having any sun in the house, because he's going to look at it. And the rest of his incredibly small plot of land actually faces this kind of environment. This has become our new context. This is we can't imagine that we are always going to be creating this pristine oasis of peace within this kind of incredible pieces of nature, because such situations exist very, very rarely today. But we have to build within this. And if you go to the local communities today, they tell you have to build something like your neighbors did. But these neighbors are illegal. They have had an abolition in the 1980s, and they have now become our new context. So this is our new, in a way, cultural space in which we as architects have to operate. And we shouldn't be afraid of, in a way, confronting it. And this is the site where the house actually becomes its own fence. We try to create a kind of a condition where this house would reappropriate the existing typology. If the local community tells us you have to build something like the neighbors, and if this is the model of the neighbors, we are trying to pull it apart and recompose it into a kind of a new reality, which would still remain within the language of the proposed, but then try to transform it into a kind of a new situation. You don't want to look at your neighbors, so therefore the house is going to have a profile, this is the living room, of a periscope. It's going to catch the sun from the south, and it's going to direct your views towards the north. In a very simple gesture, by lifting the living room onto the upper floor, you have conquered the views of the forest. You don't have to look into your own fence. The ground floor would become a kind of a super condensed space. This is a very ordinary family, and most of our clients are actually extremely ordinary people. A kind of a condensed space of a ground floor which becomes like a ryokan. It can open up in the morning. You can slide all of these doors. So the entire space, these rooms are maybe 8 square meters for the children, but they basically can completely open up, so the children can play and use this space during the day as a kind of a communal space, but in the night it becomes kind of a ryokan, bordered by this continuous work desk for the entire family. And then the living room is going to be a complete change of scale, and is going to be this kind of more like a loft-like space, which basically overlooks the view. The living room is in fact a bridge, which is constructed in steel. Material, well, not very maybe usual, and this is going to be your new recomposed house. This is the first house we actually built. It's actually pretty old, and recently there was a publication about our work, and you can see that this house has aged a lot, and I think has gained also a lot of quality through this kind of the idea of aging. It's completely wrapped in natural larch, completely untreated, and left to become gray over time. So as you face the building, it becomes this kind of a periscope situation, a kind of something that joins you but also separates you from the neighbors. You're going to enter where the cars are also going to be parked. You're going to lift the entire ground that surrounds the house to a level of 70 centimeters, and then continue it inside the house with a kind of a continuous working desk for the entire family. This is not just a gesture. This actually relieves you from the obligation of having a fence around the house, and you don't have nothing to protect because nobody's going to jump onto your 70 centimeter high plot. Then on the other side, where all of these sliding doors are going to be slid in the morning, you have a continuous window, which in this case is at the level of 40 centimeters, so that from your bed you can actually look outside. And then the stair is going to be this kind of changing element where the entire space is going to change and bring you to a kind of a loft-like space of the upper floor. So in a sense, The traditional model of the house has been recomposed into a kind of a new reality. Friends of ours have lived in a skyscraper before. They have no use for the garden. For them, the roof of the bedrooms is the best garden they could ever have, that they could ever wish for, because it allows them to kind of enjoy this incredible northern views of the nature. What I'm trying to show is that in a way, as you can see in the plans, the whole set of relations in this building has been changed, and the whole set of relations, new relations established, and mainly stemming from the fact that it exists within the kind of a context that we have there. But sometimes there is no context. This is another location like that, and in a sense, once you go there, this is a wet flatlands around Ljubljana, and it's a kind of a former wet area, and this is a city which has, through this incredible growth in the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, become a part of the city. So another friends of ours bought a plot of land because it was also very cheap in this kind of situation, somewhere like that. So when you go there, you basically, there's no there, as a professor of mine used to say. There is nothing about this location. It's a flat piece of land bordering nothing. You're looking in a few houses. So there is, as an architect, there is nothing in a way that you can start from. There is nothing to build a kind of a relation to a kind of a communal space or to the space of the city, because there is, in fact, no city. So this family has one specificity, and this is where you then shift your focus and maybe start thinking about the set of relations that define family as a model to build a kind of a new community. This family has 4 kids. This is a couple that has been together for 20 years, but then through miracles of modern medicine managed to become parents after 20 years of living together. And they have had 4 kids in a very quick succession. And maybe this is enough to create a model of a house which would allow them to enjoy this newly found status of a family for a period while their children are very small. And this is what we propose. So their house relates to nothing, but except to the length of the site. So it's a 55 by 20 meter site, and the house is 50 meters by 5 meters. So it's a very long sausage that the entire family is going to inhabit together. This is a model, of course, a reference that we propose, and we show it also to the client. We actually work very closely with the people, because this really, the things that you do really change their lives profoundly. We propose a kind of the idea of, this was a political project, of course, but we actually took it to show them that this idea of colonization of space and living together and having some sort of separation could be a viable model for their vision of the family. And this is the final product, a house which is 2.5 meters high, 50 meters long, and 5 meters wide. It's completely glazed on the north and the south. And it basically is a one-room space. It is a one-room space that starts from the kitchen and ends with the last kid's bedroom. The only privacy spaces are these kind of cabins that exist for the children to sleep and to have at least a minimum amount of privacy. And then there is a whole series of sliding doors and walls that can at some point slide out and provide privacy once the children start growing. So for us, this is enough. This is enough of a context. We have tried to create a kind of a platform in which this family can enjoy their status of living together for quite a big number of years. The edges of the plot will become the edges of the building once the greenery has grown, because the entire building is glazed. And the actual physical production on the site, we love going to the sites, and I think that's a lot of our buildings are basically, a lot of our problems of our buildings are resolved on the site, because we're very worried also how our buildings behave over time, which I think hasn't been a concern for a lot of our colleagues in the recent years. The site is actually, the building is the site, and the site is the building. You see that the new foundations of the building have covered the entire piece of land that they own. The building is built in steel, one for quickness, second for the lightness that we want to achieve with this kind of a structure that should almost look like an inhabited gas station rather than a building. And when finished, it looks like this. There is this cantilever on the south, which basically covers this terrace, but the calculation of this cantilever is that in the summer, this is the point where the shadow from this cantilever is going to come. This also makes these floors relatively lower than you would expect. They're 2 meters 45. And then in the winter, there is this horizontal beam of light that's going to warm up the entire space of the house. So it's a kind of very primitive ecology, but it also allows us to use very cheap glass, and it allows us not to have any sun protection in the building. Every inhabitant of the house has his own single door, which is going to be his door and his point of identification of the interior space that belongs to him. And this is what it looks like once you start entering. And once you enter, this is now completely overgrown, so this neighbor doesn't participate in the life of the house anymore. And then the space of the kitchen. You start walking towards the bedrooms, and you start sliding the doors, and you open the door, and you're in parents' workspace, and then a parent's bedroom, and then you open another door, and you slide another door, and you fold another door, and by folding all of this, you basically expose the space of 50 meters, which becomes this new platform for the life of this small community to happen. I think then of course the way the way the children can have their own spaces, which they also design themselves, and which can basically be also separated from the space, providing a kind of privacy for growth. I'm deliberately not mentioning the aesthetic aspects or the way this building looks or the materials that we use, because I think it is, of course, important. It exists in architecture. Architecture is about things also trying to be beautiful, but I think there is this kind of a previous story, that there is this kind of a logic of a community that somehow means much more to us than the actual logic, the actual quest for pure, simple beauty. The beauty comes when the children, well, first time we come to visit this house, the 4 children give us presents, which are drawings, and they're only living in the house for a few days. But these drawings capture the entire idea of their houses. So these are kids which are 6 years old, or 4 and 6 and 7 or something. And they understand the space that we have created completely. So in that sense, I think this is the kind of the pleasure of this kind of projects. Or this another child who is 6 up there is actually enchanted by the idea of a house as existing as a kind of a table. And the third child is having a kind of a combination of a floor plan and elevation, which kind of gives definition. These are the work desks for each child, which are on the northern elevation, which I didn't show before. So this is what, in a way, is this level of pleasure, if you want, that somehow we are looking for in the projects that we construct. And as a continuation of this project, because these are brothers, these are 2 brother and sister projects, 3 years later, this is now in Prague, in the suburbia of Prague, another young family asks us, based on that house, to do something very similar to them, for them, and it is a Czech family that has absolutely 0 money, but we still do a project in Prague, and now it's under construction, on a very similar situation, a kind of so this is something that is very common to us, and I think this is something that is very common, that we share also in Spain, how to kind of inject this kind of new realities into the already destructive environments that we have created, and how to maybe try to give meanings to the kind of everyday lives, rather than, and how to maybe also have this idea of communal or togetherness on a much smaller scale sometimes than the idea of than what we immediately start thinking about. So on this site we have proposed a village of houses rather than a village of rooms rather than a single building. So very similar to the previous project, and of course something that has been explored also by a lot of our Japanese colleagues in the recent years, but I think very fitting for this particular situation. This family is going to live in a kind of a small village where this complete house is 160 square meters, so you should, or 140 square meters, sorry. So a series of very small rooms which are going to be the columns for the space of the living room. They're going to provide the basic intimacy of space for every individual, the parents, child 1, child 2, guest, service, kitchen, outside storage space, and the bathroom and the garage. And they're going to be joined by a single roof, which is this space, which is the space of the living room, which is at the same time the kind of the main communication of the house. We actually were calculating millimeters in this case, because these people really have no money, and their intention is to maybe use their extended family to build the house. So as their extended family has carpenters, this actually decides for us the method of construction. It's a wooden construction, it's a wooden house. Constructed 100% out of wood, but also clad in wood. And at the moment we are trying to develop the details which will enable this kind of a larger family to who are not very skilled carpenters to kind of help and build this entire house. So the idea that only the central space has this gridded structure of the exposed beams of the wood and is basically suspended like a series of swimming pools of wooden structure which are inserted in between the boxes, and these are the structural elements that support it. The materiality of the house is also maybe decided for us. Of course, we use as guidelines, but our first idea of having a very cheap oak in Czech Republic fails. So the building is clad in larch and pre-patinated with a kind of a silver pre-patination so that you don't have to maintain it afterwards, while only the main spaces of the house are going to have this kind of a wooden appearance of the wooden roof. The same elevation is also used inside the house, so basically there is no difference in between the inside and the outside. There are just sheets of glass that divide the inside and the outside space of the house. So the inside is also clad in the same kind of wood paneling. And then the detailing, which has to be simplified to a degree that it can be really in the conditions of current we have in Europe, carried out by a kind of the joint effort of a few friends, a few members of the family, and the owners themselves. So we are not running away from this kind of projects, even though, of course, in a kind of ruthless environments that we live in today, these are not exactly the most lucrative, but are very satisfying pieces of work that you can provide. And then if I just, as I wanted before, touch upon the idea of pleasure, because this was already in the presentation, the idea of pleasure, something that is not something that we may not necessarily need, but something that we might be able to enjoy. This is an extension to 1950s house. It is a very small construction, a pavilion thrown into the garden, which basically joins the space of the house, the living room of the house, with the living room of the garden. What makes this pavilion look like it does? These are the urban planners' lines. These are the protection lines we have to build within this limit, and this is in fact the limit for the house. And this house is going to float above ground, and it's going to connect the house where the ground floor is now on this kind of level to somehow closer to the garden. This is what we do, something maybe not so very logical. It is a kind of a white concrete construction which stands on 5 big white rocks at the bottom. It's completely insulated on the interior, and it works like a kind of a glove. Its shape is determined by urban planners, and therefore as an architect you're able to step back and look at your building being done by someone else, which is sometimes a relief, because very often we have this incredible need to design stuff and not just to kind of manage. And so in a sense we manage this shape of the building but just by distorting the roof, which is something that of course as an architect you can do, and this gives you the idea of a kind of a camera. So the building is going to connect to the garden because there is going to be these huge openings connecting the space, this very unusual space of the living room to the space of the garden. So in a sense we try to redefine what could a living room be, and it's basically just a kind of a small box thrown into the space of the garden. Another idea for a redefinition of what a weekend house could be, and I think maybe it relates to the previous projects, a weekend house near the Lake of Bohinj in a kind of a completely protected environment of a national park. We have to build a house which looks exactly like this. Our clients have had this house for already 200 years, and it's built out of rammed earth and inserted in between wood, and it has completely deteriorated, and it cannot be used anymore. And we have to basically build a kind of a replica, and this kind of a replica looks like this, because the weekend house is a house that you use only for 2 days a week. It's a complete waste of space, I know, and a complete waste of resources. But in a sense, it is something that rich people can afford and do afford. And you have to manage it like a container, and this is what we tell them. Basically, for 5 days a week, this house is just an object thrown into the landscape and is basically completely closed. And the moment you start inhabiting it, on a Friday evening, it opens up and becomes a house. It closely resembles the previous house, except that the plan has changed. We have also built all the external spaces into this house, and just a few bedrooms on the upper level, so that at the moment when you arrive to your weekend destination, the house explodes and starts and allows you to kind of conquer this piece of land for the weekend. All of the exterior spaces of the house are completely included in the house, because we don't want to basically build anything within the land. So this is, when you open it up, you can basically sit down and eat on a sheet of grass. And then when you open the back elevation of the house up, you can basically conquer the garden in front of you. The idea that this house, and of course the only, let's say, exception to a traditional model is this, is the window, which happens on the level of the bed, and which allows you also to kind of have views outside when you wake up on a Saturday morning. On a Sunday evening, the house becomes again mute and basically returns back to its original condition of hibernation, waiting for the next weekend to happen. So the idea of managing this objects of objects of desire that we actually use only occasionally is something that was the subject. Again, back to this work of Dohosu. And again, back to the work of the kind of this jump in scales, or jump in focuses, or jump in relations, and then there is in between the kind of the individual and the group of individuals, and then the society at large. And our office has been working for a very long time on social housing, and this was somehow our bread and butter of our practice for very many years. And we have built quite a lot of it, and I'm going to maybe show only one of it. But one of the projects that we did, this was not a project, this was a proposal that we actually showed the client, and he almost had a heart attack, so we immediately said that it's a joke. No? But it was, for us, it was real. It was the idea of our inability as architects to manage the individual wishes of people who inhabit the spaces we do, and the kind of necessity to have to produce a uniform spaces. And of course, but this is something that is always in the back of our minds, and something that, in a way, emerges from time to time in different projects. And this is one such project for social housing that we did some years already ago, I think 5 or 6 years, 5 years maybe ago. And this is what you're faced with. When you start to do a competition, this is what you get as an urban plan. There is a lot of this kind of destruction. It is not a destruction that exists on sites. It is a destruction that is embedded in our legal documents, at least in Slovenia, but I'm sure the same applies to Spain. This has been done in 1980, maybe. And now, 30 years later, this same drawing is a guideline for what we do today. So in a sense, you have to be able to manage these things. This has become law. We have actually transformed urban plans into kind of a legal documents, but not only into legal documents, but with a kind of incredible limitations for any sort of change. And this is what you get when you do a competition. And then you go to the site, you think this must be some sort of a Berlin site, or it looks like IBA from 1980s, but you go there and it's open fields. And then there is a huge railway, and then there is some commercial housing. So there are all these different situations, but the urban plan has this kind of rigidity and muteness that you have to deal with. And because it is social housing, and because social housing is incredibly regulated, like everywhere, I think it's the same thing in Spain. Every square meter of the apartment is allocated. The only thing that somehow authorities always fail to regulate, which is very strange, is exactly the public space, is exactly the surrounding space. It is, the public sphere is something that is, in fact, still an unregulated space. It is very often the wish of an architect to deal with the idea of public space that surrounds the building. So, in a sense, nobody asks you to do these things. It's something that exists there, and there is no legal regulation that tells you something about it. So as all of these spaces are extremely regulated, what we propose is that this becomes then extremely regulated and therefore extremely small. In Slovenia, you practically have to have 3 kids in order to qualify for a 2-bedroom apartment. So in a sense, this exterior space becomes the surplus space of this, it becomes a kind of a living room of this housing settlement. And we propose a kind of an overlap of different generations of people and different programs, which looks maybe exaggerated. We even try to exaggerate and we try to make it much more there than you need to have. But in a sense, we think this is very important to overlap all these different kids and older people and kind of teenagers all over this kind of one huge carpet, with a very strong definition which will give them a sense of place and a sense of kind of extension of their apartments, because their apartments are miserable and they're governed by law and they're going to be this size and that's it. Of course, the urban planners have not allowed you to go any further than this outline, so the only space that you can have in your unit, maybe an open space, an unregulated space again, is the space of the balcony, which will suspend on the edge of every one of these units, and which has this kind of iconography of the neighboring railways, which basically has the only space in your apartment that has no roof and allows you to kind of breathe some air. I'm just showing this project in a sense that the idea of creating this kind of community in the middle goes also with the idea of creating a building which would try to destroy this very symmetrical and very bizarre urban setup into something like this. And this would be the envelope. The building, as you turn around each of these 6 buildings, the silhouette, the kind of perception of the building is going to change. You're never going to see the same building again. And then the system of cladding, which I'm not going to go into, just quickly, it's basically we're using the productive size of the panels, and then we are enlarging the way we as architects screw the panels onto the elevation, because we are always obsessed with this idea that the buildings should be invisible and have the screws and everything should be looking like it hangs up in the air, and we actually want to work with this and make everything visible and make everything much more visible than it ever needs to be, because then it becomes a kind of a bizarre or accidental ornament that gives a kind of a strange definition to a building. The first thing you see on this building are the screws. It's the smallest element of the building. The elevation that changes from side to side, and also depending on light. The color of the panels, these are ferrocement panels, and they're colored with ferroxide, so they're oxidized. And the way that the profile of the building changes from side to side, so that towards the railways it becomes a kind of a series of 6 sentinels, and always relating back, of course, to this central space, to the space of this kind of central living room, completely inhabited. And this is an observation that I have to Louis's wish for more photographs with people. These are photographs without people. Because I think it's not the amount of people that you have in the photographs that's going to make the spaces work or not work. Of course, you have to trust me that this somehow managed to work. Some other projects of ours don't work at all. But in a sense, I think it's the way you work on those spaces and the meaning, not the design that you give them, the meaning that you give them is what makes them work or not. As you approach the city of Ljubljana, these are going to be the first 3 buildings, or the first 6 buildings of the city of Ljubljana, which are guarding this kind of main railway entrance into the city. So I'm showing these examples of collective housing, and especially the examples of social housing, which basically, in order to maybe illustrate the idea that the idea of community or the idea of communal can be developed through also very bizarre and very modest programs. These programs are all done for much smaller budget than for social housing than you have in Spain. But we didn't do only social housing. And we did also things outside of Slovenia. And this is a housing project that we did in Basel. And this is a competition for a kind of a Kinderspital. It's on the Rhine River in one of the richest cities in Europe. And I think Roger is gone, I suppose. But it's his city. And on these river banks of Basel, the city wants to invest money to build a housing project, but a housing project for rich people, so it should replace this hospital. And what we propose, and I'm going to go further into this, is a very frivolous, seemingly very frivolous shape that somehow follows the contours of the urban plan, but kind of creates also a kind of a spatial disruption in space. Spatial disruption within, and this is a program. The program of the housing is that there should be some rental and some very luxurious units to buy. The luxurious units to buy are going to be for older people, for kind of people that don't have children anymore, and the rental are going to be for families. So this weird frivolous shape, seemingly frivolous shape,
splits the building into two, because the back apartments are going to have more bedrooms, so they have this wide concave spaces, and then the front apartments are going to have more living space because they need less bedrooms. So this is the logic that basically redefines this building, and this is what it looks like. And what we propose is to lift this building off the air, because I think that also even the luxury housing could become a very big motor for improvement of the life of the city. So we lift the entire building. It sits on 6 columns, and the 6 columns are the 6 staircases. And the space of the street in the back comes completely to the front of the river. This is the ground floor, so there are a few things that are closed, but everything else is just a smooth transition throughout the building. The top floor, which shows you the rental apartments with more bedrooms, and the front apartments with less bedrooms, but very, very large living rooms. The entire building is structure. So there is a kind of a huge Virendel beam, which of course is very difficult to make it curving, because I think we also think that in Switzerland these things actually become possible, these incredibly complex structures. So that these are the verticals of the Virendel. There is a piece of concrete on top, and there is a piece of concrete at the bottom, and that it becomes this kind of a huge curving beam that supports the house. At the same time, it supports the glass elevation of the building. So, and then there is this incredible amount of space that flows under the building, and the kind of seamless continuation of the garden from the space of the back streets or the back blocks to the space of the river. Why am I showing yet another collective housing project? Just because I want to also work, well, this is a different kind of housing project. This is a student housing that we designed for the University of Ljubljana. And this also illustrates a kind of anomalous conditions in which we have had to work in the last 10 years. This project was designed over a period of 2.5 months. So it actually went on site after 2.5 months after we were awarded the commission. And before that, we actually had 3 weeks to do a competition in order to win it. And it's this location is somewhere very near the center of the city. So therefore, this kind of decisions, of course, this building is going to stand there for the next 50 or 100 years, depending on its resilience. But you know, there was 2.5 months of planning period that went into the making of this project, and I think it's somehow bizarre, but it is a very strong character of the way we have been carrying work for the last 10 years, and I'm sure the same things have been happening in Spain. But we were practically forced by the conditions of our society to do things like this. So basically, we have to manage a project in a way that the ground floor becomes this collective space of the student lives, because basically for them this is their house, this is their home for 6 years while they study at the university. And this collective base, well, you can see it here, the way it sits in the kind of a surrounding condition. And then these 88 trees, these are famous parks that exist all over former Yugoslavia. And this is 88 trees that all the cities had to plant in 1980, when Marshal Tito, the former Yugoslav president, was 88 years old. It was very few months before he died. Every city in former Yugoslavia had to plant 88 trees. And these 88 trees have now become a wonderful park. And in a sense, what I'm just trying to say is that even, you know, and we have been complaining about this dictatorship for very many years, but I actually truly believe that sometimes even kind of dictatorial positions can provide quality, at least in this case, for the cities that we inhabit. The ground floor of this building is completely transparent. There are no transitions, and there are no, we try to make as little hierarchy in spaces as possible. So this is the bicycle storage, but this is a study space, so they're just separated by glass walls. So there is this kind of a platform, a transparent platform on which the life of the students is going to happen. You can see all the way throughout the buildings. And then on the upper floor, there's going to be a very rigid repetition of housing units, which is going to form the two slabs or 4 slabs on top of the building. This ground floor is completely evenly clad in glass. So even where there are structures and walls, there is a huge cladding of transparent glass that goes around and around the building. And so that even from looking from the outside, you can always also see this interior courtyard, which is somehow the center of this building. And this is the also view that Luis was showing when he introduced us or introduced our work 2 days ago, the central space of this student housing. All the service spaces are also going to face onto this completely indiscriminately. So this is the space of the bicycle shed. So this is where now there are thousands of bikes, and this is the space where the students are studying, and that over there is a huge living room party space that you can rent from the Student Housing Association to do parties. And then there is completely black corridors that take you up to the units where you're going to sleep for 6 years of your life, and to the space that you're going to call your home. And this is just a box, a prefab bathroom, and 2 exactly the same rooms. This is the maximum configuration of 4 people. We managed to convince the clients that this same unit can work for everybody. So normal configuration would be 2 people, but they can be 4 people. There can be a living room and a couple in the other room. So this is a kind of a minimal room size that works in all different configurations of social relations that we may establish as 20-something-year-olds. So it kind of generalizes a population, but at the same time it allows for change. And then all these intimate spaces, all the bedrooms are going to be something that we are going to allow people to regulate on their own, while the communal spaces, the spaces of the dining room, which face the street, are going to be the fixed spaces, the kind of symbols of life, student life that happens on the outside. So this is one of the terraces and one of the dining rooms, and you see that the radiator is covered with a bench, and therefore you have to sit here, and you are exposed to the space of the city. This was sent to us by a group of students that have filmed this couple for a very long time, and there are much more radical photographs that came out of this movie. But well, it kind of just illustrates what we try to show, that while being allowed to protect parts of their lives behind this kind of a metallic curtain that folds out completely or completely closes their private spaces, they also are in a way forced to participate in the public life of the city for the time that they use the kind of the living rooms or the dining rooms of their apartments. So this is the idea of kind of maybe a slightly subversive way of an attempt to create kind of communities. And maybe in the end I'm just going to show some of the new work, because I think all of our friends from Pamplona have seen most of the projects that we have done, because I have already been teaching here. And to show some of the new work is again the idea of how to manage our common fears, for example. We have recently won a competition to build a mosque in Ljubljana. It is the first. We have to finish? Okay. I can be, okay. Okay, sure. So we have recently been commissioned to design a mosque, and this is a kind of a fear topic that has been existing in Slovenia for about 30 years now. There have been many locations proposed for the Islamic community to build their mosque, and there have been many thousands of people who protested strongly against this. So in the end, the Islamic community, with a new mayor, who is a left-wing mayor, actually was allocated the location. Of course, everybody was extremely happy, but this new location is an industrial zone. So it's very near the center of the city. This is the center of Ljubljana, but in fact, it's an industrial area where the railways come into the city. So at the same time, the wish of the Islamic community, which is mainly Bosnian in Slovenia, it's the Bosnian people who have come to work in Slovene mines or Slovene factories in the time of former Yugoslavia and have remained afterwards in this. So this is the main, let's say, contents of this community, but they have again been pushed into a kind of a hidden position near the city center, but still not surrounded by any life at the moment, and which kind of provides this kind of splendid isolation. Nobody complained about him having this site. So in this, there was a very big international competition, and we won a prize a few months ago. And what we proposed a different reading. Of course, the Islamic community expected a mosque which would look like Ottoman mosques. They expect it's a very traditional community, and and also it was very difficult. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to communicate. But what we proposed, this is a very grainy image, but this is a growth of Sarajevo in the beginning of the 19th century. The city developed through development of mosques. So mosque was the kind of the starting point around which the parts of the city respective parts of the city were were developing. So these were called mahallas. So the donors would build a mosque, and then around the mosque, the people would start converging, and then the part of the city would emerge. So in a sense, and of course, some of these mosques are great. This is one of these great mosques of Sarajevo, but in a way, this Ottoman model of a mosque, which was not so very familiar to us. This will not be the first mosque in Slovenia. A mosque existed in the Austro-Hungarian times. In the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian troops, somewhere in the mountains in Slovenia, built this kind of a mosque, which already is a very strange mix in between a traditional house and the domed sky of the mosque. And the relation of Slovenia to Islamic culture is also much deeper, because there was this incredible architect, and I'm sure that in Pamplona you will find it also in your library, Dusan Grabrian, who was researching the Islamic architecture of Bosnia for 40 years and made an incredible set of documents that document the Islamic architecture of Bosnia, both domestic and religious. And also has books which put this architecture in Bosnia from the beginning of the 20th century into relation with the development of the modern movement. So this is from the same period of when Villa Sava was built. This is the caretaker's house, and it also appears in one of the Grabrian's houses, where he builds up a relation of this kind of walled spaces to a relation that exists in Islamic architecture of Bosnia. So there is this kind of feeling of the typical Sarajevo street, which you have to have in mind, and which is not really something that you're going to ever reproduce in the project. And then there is this idea that the mosque could be a kind of a new seat for the development of the entire neighborhood. This is not our proposal. This is something that is a vision of the urban planners. But what we propose is to split the program of the mosque, which is indeed the Islamic cultural and religious center. So there is a school, and there are some offices and apartments and stuff like that, into a series of buildings which are going to generate more this kind of the idea of a kind of a small village. Oops, where's this? There. And then, because this village is in such an incredible, and this could be a generator for the new development, and we're going to basically just lift the ground by 1 meter, so to separate it from this kind of a dirt of the industrial surroundings, at least for the moment. We are not going to build something that closes off the community, because basically the whole aspect of the community is to be in communication with the surroundings, so they have to be part of the common space of the city, and we are going to build all the things around. This is the new complex of the mosque, the 2 parks, one small park and the other park, and then the mosque, and then the school and the buildings, the apartment buildings. This is the way it somehow works, and I'm going to get back to it. There is another layer of information. I think Mecca was very important, very, very popular with Louis and with Norman Foster, and now you're going to see it again, but this time with a different kind of purpose. The Western depiction of Mecca, how we as Western people see Mecca in the beginning of the 19th century, how we try to understand the different culture, and how we give it actually some pieces of our own stuff invented, to give it a kind of a meaning that could be grasped by the people that are going to look at this once you come back home and show this to a printed thing. And then the Kaaba, the center of it, where the kind of the textile is something that we are incredibly interested in. Kaaba is, in fact, in its function, it looks like this, but when it's undressed, it looks like this. So there is this kiswe, there is this ritual shroud, which covers the actual building. And this is something that inspires her very much. But of course, Kaaba is not a mosque. The mosque is the whole space, no? So the whole open space, this is an open-air mosque, and this is just a kind of a sacred place. And then the pieces of this local architecture, the lattice work, the local Bosnian architecture, the lattice work that you have on the windows, which at the same time we think that could be provide a kind of a structural elements. And maybe the most important, the portability of religion. For us, it's incredibly important. This particular image, this is a 15th century Iranian miniature of a mosque, of a portable mosque, of a tent mosque. And of course, it talks about the portability, but it also talks about the kind of ability to practice religious service at different places, and the kind of the minimum material that requires for a kind of space to be defined as such. And then again, I go to my favorite, again, Korean artist Doho Soo, who actually creates his own house. This is a copy of his parents' staircase, all together with the light switch and the cable. No? And he carries it around with him. He lives in New York, and he basically carries pieces of his Korean house completely made out of this transparent and translucent fabric. So this is something that we also try to propose to an Islamic community. We try to propose that their mosque should not, that the idea of this dome, which was covering the mosque, which is the idea of a kind of a sky that defines the universe that stands above the congregation, is maybe its materiality is in fact irrelevant, or could maybe today be seen as unneeded. Two parks, the mosque towards Mecca and the communication of the mosque through this strange assemblage of buildings to the surrounding areas. All of the buildings, this is the apartment building, this is the school building, are only facing outwards. So they are actually not facing the space of the school, but they are facing outwards. And the huge lattice work structure, this structure is a steel structure 1 meter deep and 2 centimeters thick, constructed like a boat, with a cast concrete in between this steel structure, which basically welds it together, and so the steel structure becomes its kind of a reinforcement. So here, it's that, and here there is just exactly the same, but then reduced thing, which is still a protective shroud, which still works like a traditional lattice work. And the floor plan of the new mosque, where it completely opens to the outside space. This is a structural element, but at the same time the individual praying space, the itikaf. The set of elements that define the space of the mosque, the ground which rises up to become a new minaret. I think that we are going to still have huge fights with the Islamic community about this, because we propose a minaret which looks like a chimney, and all this area is surrounded by chimneys. And then the first floor, the women's part, the school, and the apartments that surround the mosque, and the kind of the spaces, the intimate spaces that can be established within this kind of complex. The space, the prayer space above the mosque, so there is this huge chandelier, and then a textile dome, on which we are working with a kind of we're trying to work with a Slovenian artist that lives in US, who is obsessed with the work of Buckminster Fuller. So we're trying to construct this kind of a complete single piece of textile, which would also have a rigidity through sewing, and transformed into a mosque. This is something that we use to the local imams to explain how we want to bring back pieces of the other mosque, which looked a little bit Western, but then we want to do something. It's also a language of communication, a language of trying to put forward the architectural idea to a community which may not have such an incredible understanding of modernity, of contemporary architecture. And the way you approach the space of the new mosque, where this dome is floating somewhere deep inside the space of this structure, and the way that this kind of reduction of materials also allows you to kind of feel the religious space. So for us, of course, all the banality of life. This park is broken and sunken, so it goes slowly down, and there is a restaurant, and then there is a parking, and all the other stuff that this community also needs. I'm not going to show you any more details, but I'm maybe going to, and I'm going to skip the last project that I wanted to show, because I think it would take too long. And recently we have been awarded a competition to extend Plečnik's library, and it's only a few weeks old, but I'm going to maybe end with another note. I used to have a teacher in my British school who was expelled from a Swiss school where he was teaching before, who used to actually bring a lot of poetry to our classes, and he was expelled precisely because of his maybe left-wing ideas, or I don't know for what other reasons. And he brought once a poem which was by Bertolt Brecht, and which was called "The Worker Reads History." And it starts something like this. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? Was it kings who hold the craggy blocks of stone? Of course, it's Bertolt Brecht asks himself, or a worker asks himself through the mouth of Bertolt Brecht, if it was really the kings that we hail in history that were actual laborers on the building site. And then he talks about pyramids and about all the wonders of the world, which are mainly architectural things. whether it was the people who ordered them that actually also built them. In a sense, I'm not using it to propose a kind of a political or whatever kind of conclusion to an idea, but more to propose the kind of necessity to reread our histories and to reread our current destinies day and day again, and from project to project, and that only this may be ability to reread and be critical from a project to a project will be a kind of a potential ground that we might have for changes that we're going to face in the coming period. Thanks.